The snow crunched under my boots as I carried our supplies to the cabin. My best friend Mark had been talking about this trip for weeks. It was his idea to spend Christmas at this remote cabin by a frozen lake, far away from the city and its noise. Just me, Mark, his girlfriend Lisa, and her brother Greg. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, but I already had a bad feeling about it. The cabin was small and old, but cozy. A wood stove sat in the corner, the only source of heat. The lake stretched out in front of us, a sheet of white and gray under the cloudy sky. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. "We're gonna catch so many fish," Mark said as he set up his gear by the fire. "I read online that this lake is full of trout. Let's hope we don't fall through the ice trying to catch them," Lisa muttered, shivering in her thick coat. Greg laughed. "Relax, Lisa. It's thick enough. We'll be fine." We settled in that evening, eating canned food and playing cards by lantern light. The wind howled outside, making the windows rattle. Every so often, I thought I heard something else, a faint crunch of snow, like footsteps, but I told myself it was just the wind. The next morning, we decided to try ice fishing. Mark and Greg were excited, drilling holes in the ice and setting up rods. I wasn't much of a fisherman, so I sat back and watched. Lisa stayed in the cabin, saying it was too cold for her. The lake was endless and quiet, the kind of place where you feel completely alone. But as I looked around, I noticed something strange. Near the edge of the lake, half buried in the snow, was a red object. I walked over to check it out. It was a Christmas stocking. At first, I thought it was some kid's lost decoration. But as I picked it up, I noticed it was stained. The white trim at the top was smeared with something dark and dried. Blood. "Hey, Mark," I called out, holding it up. "Look at this." Mark jogged over, his boots sliding on the ice. "What the hell?" he said, taking the stocking from me. "Where'd you find this?" "Right here," I said, pointing to the spot. It was half buried in the snow. Greg came over too, his face pale. "That's creepy," he said. "Why would it be out here?" "Maybe someone dropped it," Mark said, but he didn't sound convinced. He turned it over in his hands, then froze. "There's something inside." We all leaned in as he reached into the stocking. He pulled out a piece of paper, folded and yellowed with age. He unfolded it, and we saw a single sentence scrawled in messy handwriting. "Stay away from the lake." "What the hell does that mean?" Greg asked, his voice shaky. Mark shook his head. "Probably some prank," he said, though he didn't sound sure. "Let's just get back to fishing." But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see a figure standing there. But there was nothing, just the wind and the snow. We didn't catch any fish that day. Mark joked that the lake must be cursed, but none of us laughed. The stocking and its warning had cast a shadow over the trip. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The cabin was dark, the only sound the crackling of the fire. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again. The crunch of snow outside. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Mark," I whispered, but he was snoring on the couch. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window. There was nothing there, just the empty lake and the dark woods beyond. The next morning, Greg was gone. We searched the cabin, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. His coat and boots were gone, and the door was slightly ajar, snow blowing in. "Maybe he went out for a walk," Mark said, though he looked worried. "He'll come back." But I wasn't so sure. Why would Greg leave without telling anyone, especially in the freezing cold? We decided to search for him. Mark and I took one side of the lake, while Lisa stayed by the cabin in case Greg returned. We called his name over and over, our voices echoing in the empty wilderness. Then we found the hole. It was a jagged opening in the ice, about the size of a manhole. Fresh cracks radiated out from it, the edges wet and dark. Nearby, half buried in the snow, was one of Greg's gloves. "Oh God," Mark whispered, his face pale. "You don't think?" I didn't want to think it, but the evidence was clear. Greg had fallen through the ice. We ran back to the cabin and told Lisa. She burst into tears, blaming us for not keeping an eye on him. But as we tried to comfort her, I noticed something strange. The stocking was gone. It had been sitting on the table by the fire, but now it was nowhere to be seen. "Did one of you move it?" I asked. Lisa shook her head, still crying. Mark frowned. "I didn't touch it." A cold chill ran down my spine. Someone had been in the cabin. That night, none of us could sleep. We huddled together by the fire, clutching the knives from the kitchen for protection. The wind howled outside, and every so often we heard the crunch of snow, footsteps circling the cabin. At some point, the sound stopped, and we thought whoever it was had gone. But in the morning, we found the tracks, dozens of them, circling the cabin and leading back to the lake. We decided to leave. The trip wasn't worth it anymore, not with Greg gone and someone stalking us. But when we got to the car, we found all 4 tires slashed. Lisa started sobbing again, and Mark punched the hood in frustration. We were trapped. With no other options, we decided to hike to the nearest town, about 10 miles away. We packed what we could carry and set off, sticking close together. The forest was dense and quiet, the snow muffling our footsteps. About halfway to town, we found another stocking hanging from a low branch. It was identical to the first one, bloodstains and all. Inside was another note: "You should have stayed away." We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We ran. By the time we reached town, it was nearly dark. We burst into the police station, gasping and half frozen, and told them everything. They sent a search party to the cabin, but they didn't find Greg. They didn't find the stockings either. Just our slashed tires and the hole in the ice. To this day, I don't know what really happened at that lake. Was it a prank, a warning, or something worse? All I know is that Greg is gone, and every Christmas I think about that bloodied stocking and the words inside: "Stay away from the lake." "15 years ago, when I was a senior in high school, we did something we thought was good. Every Christmas, our school ran a charity drive to collect donations for families in need. That year, a few of us decided to go door to door collecting food and money. We thought we were helping, spreading the holiday spirit. We had no idea how wrong we were. It was me, my best friend Kevin, his girlfriend Sarah, and another guy named Pete. Pete wasn't really part of our friend group, but he volunteered to come, and we didn't say no. We had a list of neighborhoods to cover, starting with the quieter, more spread out homes on the edge of town. The kind of houses that were big, but didn't always look like it. By the time we got to the last house on our route, it was almost dark. Snow had started falling, light but steady, and the wind was picking up. The house stood alone at the end of a long driveway, surrounded by bare trees. It was old, with chipped paint and crooked shutters. Kevin hesitated, but Sarah laughed and said, "Come on, it's Christmas! What's the worst that could happen?" We rang the doorbell, and after a long moment, an older man opened the door. He was tall, maybe in his late 60s, with gray hair and a wrinkled face. He wore a thick sweater that looked handmade. He smiled, but something about it felt off, too wide, like he was trying too hard. "Good evening, kids," he said. "What brings you out here in this weather?" "We're collecting donations for the school's Christmas charity drive," Sarah said brightly. "Canned goods, toys, anything you'd like to give." The man's smile grew wider. "That's wonderful. Why don't you come inside and warm up? I've just made some hot cocoa." I didn't like the idea, and judging by the look Kevin shot me, he didn't either. But Pete was already stepping forward, saying, "Hot cocoa sounds great." Before I could protest, the man had opened the door wider, ushering us all inside. The house was warm, almost too warm, and smelled like cinnamon. The furniture was old but neat, the walls covered in faded wallpaper. A fire crackled in the fireplace, and the kitchen light cast a yellow glow over everything. "Take off your coats," the man said. "Make yourselves comfortable. I'll bring the cocoa." We sat awkwardly in the living room while he disappeared into the kitchen. Sarah was still cheerful, chatting about how nice the house was, but Kevin was quiet. I leaned over and whispered, "We shouldn't be here." "Yeah, no kidding," he muttered. "Let's drink the cocoa, thank him, and get out." The man returned a few minutes later with a tray of steaming mugs. He handed one to each of us, then sat down in a chair by the fire. "So," he said, his voice calm but sharp, "what kind of donations are you looking for?" "Anything you can spare," Sarah said, taking a sip of her cocoa. "Canned food, maybe toys or blankets." He nodded slowly, watching her. "You kids are doing a good thing," he said. "The world needs more people like you." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. His eyes lingered on Sarah too long, and his smile never faded. I glanced at my mug but didn't drink. Neither did Kevin. After a few minutes of awkward conversation, I stood up. "Thank you for the cocoa, sir, but we should really get going. There are more houses on our route." The man's smile faltered for the first time. "Oh, but it's so cold out there," he said. "Why don't you stay a little longer? Let me show you something." Before we could respond, he stood and walked to a door at the back of the room. "I have something downstairs you'll want to see. A little collection I've been working on." Kevin and I exchanged a look. "We really should go," Kevin said, his voice firm. The man didn't respond. He opened the door to the basement and stepped halfway down the stairs. "Come on," he called, his voice echoing. "You'll love it." Pete stood up. "What's the harm in looking? Maybe he has something cool." "Pete, no," I hissed, but he was already following the man down the stairs. Sarah hesitated, then got up to go after him. Kevin grabbed her arm. "We're leaving," he said. "Now." But before any of us could move, we heard the sound of a lock clicking. The man had shut the basement door from the inside, trapping Pete downstairs. "What the hell?" I said, running to the door. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Hey, let him out!" The man's voice drifted up from below. "It's rude to leave before you've seen everything." Kevin grabbed a chair and smashed it against the door, but it was solid wood and barely dented. Sarah was panicking, pacing back and forth. "We have to get help," she said. "We have to." The front door slammed shut. We turned to see the man standing there, holding a long metal pipe. His sweater was speckled with something dark, and his smile was gone. "Nobody's leaving," he said, his voice low. "What did you do to Pete?" Kevin shouted. The man didn't answer. He just stepped closer, the pipe dragging along the floor. Sarah screamed and bolted toward the kitchen, but the man moved faster than I expected, blocking her path. "You'll see Pete soon enough," he said. "You'll all see." Kevin lunged at him, trying to wrestle the pipe away. I joined in, grabbing the man's arm, but he was unbelievably strong for his age. He swung the pipe wildly, catching Kevin in the side. Kevin went down with a groan, clutching his ribs. "Run!" I shouted at Sarah. She hesitated for a second, then darted toward the back door. The man tried to grab her, but I tackled him, sending us both crashing into the coffee table. Sarah got the door open and ran out into the snow. I struggled to get up, my head spinning, but Kevin pulled me to my feet. "Go!" he said, shoving me toward the door. We burst outside, the cold air shocking my lungs. Sarah was already halfway down the driveway, screaming for help. Behind us, the man stood in the doorway, the pipe dangling from his hand. He didn't chase us. He just stood there, watching, his face blank. We made it to the road, where a passing car stopped to help. The driver called the police, and we waited, shivering, until they arrived. When the officers went into the house, they found Pete tied up in the basement. He was alive but shaken, with bruises on his wrists and face. The man was arrested, but he never explained why he did it. He just smiled that same eerie smile as they took him away. Later, we found out he had a history of mental illness and had been living alone for years. They said he probably didn't mean to hurt us, but I didn't believe that. Not for a second. Even now, 15 years later, I can't drink hot cocoa without feeling sick. Every Christmas, I think about that night and how close we came to never making it home. We thought we were spreading kindness, but we walked right into a trap. Be careful who you trust, especially when they seem too eager to invite you in. It was the first week of December, and our street was glowing with Christmas lights. Every house was decorated, strings of colorful bulbs, inflatable Santas, glowing reindeer. Every house except one, Mrs. Granger's. She lived at the end of the street in the small, faded house with the overgrown yard. Mrs. Granger wasn't friendly. She kept to herself, rarely speaking to anyone. But she always put up a few decorations for Christmas. A wreath on the door, a strand of lights on the porch. This year, her house was dark. "I bet she's sick," my wife Emily said over dinner. "Or maybe she went to stay with family for the holidays." I shrugged. "Maybe. But she doesn't have any family, does she? She's always been alone. She's old. Maybe someone's helping her." We didn't think much of it until the next day when we saw Mike, our neighbor from across the street, walking out of Mrs. Granger's house. He had a stack of mail in one hand and a cheerful smile on his face. "Hey, Mike," Emily called from our driveway. "What's going on with Mrs. Granger?" Mike strolled over, his breath visible in the cold air. She went to stay with her niece for the holidays, he said. She asked me to keep an eye on her house while she's gone. Emily and I exchanged a look. I didn't know she had a niece, Emily said. Mike shrugged. Neither did I, but she mentioned it a few weeks ago, said she was finally reconnecting with family. That's good, Emily said, but she didn't sound convinced. Neither did I. A few nights later, Emily and I were sitting on the couch, the glow of our Christmas tree lighting the room. She was flipping through her phone, but I could tell she wasn't really paying attention. Finally, she said, "It doesn't feel right." "What doesn't?" I asked. "Mrs. Granger. She's never mentioned family before. And why didn't she tell anyone else she was leaving?" "Maybe she didn't want to," I said, though I felt uneasy too. Emily sighed. "I think we should check on her house." "Why?" "Mike's already doing that." "I don't know," she said. "Something just feels off." The next evening, after the neighborhood had gone quiet, we decided to take a closer look. It was cold, our breath fogging up in the night air. The streets were empty except for the soft glow of Christmas lights. Granger's house stood at the edge of the block, dark and lifeless. We walked up her driveway, feeling like trespassers. Emily tried the doorbell, but there was no sound. I peered through the window. The house looked the same as always, neat but dated, with heavy curtains blocking most of the view. "Let's go," I whispered, but Emily shook her head. She pointed to the side of the house where the gate to the backyard hung open. We crept around to the back. The yard was a mess of weeds and dead plants, the grass crunching under our feet. Emily shone her phone's flashlight on the back door. It was slightly ajar. "Mike's been here," I said, trying to convince myself. "He probably forgot to close it." Emily ignored me and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the still night. The kitchen was dark and cold, smelling faintly of mildew. Everything looked untouched, dirty dishes in the sink, a calendar on the wall stuck on November. "Mrs. Granger?" Emily called softly, her voice trembling. No answer. We moved through the house, our footsteps muffled by thick carpet. The living room was the same as I remembered. Dusty furniture, an old TV, shelves of porcelain figurines. But something felt wrong. The air was heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. In the hallway, we found a single lamp turned on, its yellow light spilling into the shadows. Emily froze, her hand gripping my arm. "Someone's been here," she whispered. "Mike," I said again, but the word felt hollow. We reached the bedroom. The door was closed, but Emily pushed it open before I could stop her. Inside, the bed was neatly made, a thick quilt covering it. But the closet door was open, and clothes were scattered on the floor. It looked like someone had left in a hurry, or been dragged. "Let's go," I said, my voice tight. "We shouldn't be here." Emily nodded, but as we turned to leave, we heard it. A faint creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. My stomach tightened. "Is someone there?" I called, my voice shaking. Silence. We hurried back through the house and out the back door, not stopping until we were on the sidewalk. I glanced back, half expecting to see someone watching us from the dark windows, but there was nothing. The next day, we couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. Emily wanted to call the police, but I wasn't so sure. What could we tell them? That Mrs. Granger's house felt off? That Mike's story didn't add up? We decided to talk to Mike again, see if he'd slip up. We found him in his driveway, hanging lights on his house. He greeted us with a big smile, as if nothing was wrong. "Hey, Mike," I said, trying to sound casual. "How's Mrs. Granger's house holding up?" "Fine," he said, stringing another strand of lights. "I check on it every day." "You're sure she's with her niece?" Emily asked, her tone sharper than mine. Mike hesitated, just for a second. Then he laughed. "Of course. Why?" "No reason," Emily said, but I could see the tension in her jaw. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in Mrs. Granger's house, the scattered clothes, the lamp left on. Something was wrong. I finally got up, grabbed a flashlight, and headed outside. The street was quiet, the houses dark. I walked toward Mrs. Granger's house, my breath fogging in the cold air. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, maybe a sign that she was okay, something to prove we were overthinking this. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The back gate was open again. My heart pounded as I crept closer, shining my flashlight on the house. The back door was closed this time, but something caught my eye, a dark smear on the handle. Blood. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving inside the house. Someone was there. I turned and ran, my breath coming in gasps. I didn't stop until I was back home, locking the door behind me. Emily woke up when I burst into the bedroom, and I told her everything. She didn't hesitate. "We're calling the police." The cops arrived quickly, their lights flashing in the quiet street. Emily and I stood on the sidewalk, shivering as we watched them approach Mrs. Granger's house. They forced the door open and went inside, their voices echoing in the still night. It didn't take long for them to come back out, their faces grim. They wouldn't tell us much, but one thing was clear. Mrs. Granger hadn't gone to visit her niece. She hadn't left her house at all. They found her in the basement, wrapped in plastic, her body hidden behind a stack of old boxes. She'd been dead for weeks. The police questioned everyone on the street, but it didn't take them long to zero in on Mike. His story fell apart under pressure, and he eventually confessed. He'd killed Mrs. Granger after an argument about her property line. He'd used the story about her niece to cover his tracks while he cleaned up the evidence. I still can't believe it. Mike, the guy who hosted barbecues and waved at everyone on the street, was a murderer. Every Christmas, when I see the lights on his house, I think about how easy it is to hide darkness behind a friendly smile. I was broke. College tuition, rent, and food had drained my bank account to almost nothing. Finals were around the corner, and I couldn't focus on studying because I was too stressed about money. So, when I saw a Craigslist ad offering $500 for a day of holiday decorating at some rich family's mansion, I jumped on it. The ad was vague: help needed to decorate large home for Christmas. No experience necessary. Must be reliable. Pay $500 for 1 day of work. It sounded too good to be true, but I didn't have the luxury of being picky. I sent an email and got a reply within the hour. The address was in a wealthy neighborhood I'd only ever seen on TV, and the woman who responded, Mrs. Calloway, said she was excited to have me help. The day of the job, I put on my best sweater, trying to look presentable, and took the bus to their neighborhood. The houses were enormous, like something out of a movie. Perfect lawns, stone driveways, and Christmas lights already strung up on the roofs. When I got to the Calloway house, I stopped and stared. It was the biggest house on the street, a white colonial with columns in the front and a towering Christmas tree visible through the window. I felt out of place just standing there. I rang the doorbell, and Mrs. Calloway answered. She was tall, with perfectly styled hair and a wide smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be Adam," she said, looking me up and down. Come in, come in." I stepped inside, and the warmth hit me. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine, and every surface gleamed. Mrs. Calloway led me to the living room, where her husband, Mr. Calloway, sat on a leather couch. He was a big man with a deep voice and a firm handshake. "Thanks for coming," he said. "We've got a lot to do." They didn't waste time. Mrs. Calloway handed me a list of tasks: stringing lights, hanging ornaments, arranging garlands. The first few hours were fine, even pleasant. The house was beautiful, and I felt lucky to be earning so much money for something so simple. But as the day went on, things started to feel off. For one, I never saw their kids. Mrs. Calloway had mentioned in her email that she needed help because her children were too young to reach the high places, but the house was dead silent. No laughter, no toys lying around. When I asked about them, Mrs. Calloway's smile tightened. "They're with the nanny," she said quickly, then changed the subject. Then there was the way they watched me. At first I thought I was imagining it, but every time I turned around, one of them was there, just looking. Mr. Calloway lingered in the doorway while I worked, his arms crossed. Mrs. Calloway floated around, pretending to tidy up, but always staying within earshot. By the time it got dark, I was on edge. Around 6 p.m., Mrs. Calloway brought me a plate of cookies and a glass of milk. "Take a break," she said, her voice sweet. "You've earned it." I didn't want to seem rude, so I sat down and took a bite of a cookie. It tasted fine, but something about the way she watched me made my stomach turn. "Thanks," I said, setting the plate down after just one bite. "You don't like them?" she asked, her smile frozen. "No, they're great," I lied. "I'm just not that hungry." Her eyes lingered on me for a moment before she nodded. "Well, let us know if you need anything." She and Mr. Calloway left the room, and I felt a wave of relief. But as I stood up to get back to work, I noticed something under the couch, a piece of paper, crumpled and torn. I bent down and picked it up. It was part of a handwritten note, the edges stained with something dark. The writing was shaky, but I could make out a few words. Help, trapped, please. My heart raced. I stuffed the note in my pocket and tried to calm myself. Maybe it was nothing, just an old piece of paper that didn't mean anything. But the more I thought about it, the more it didn't add up. The silent house, the missing kids, the way they were always watching me. I decided it was time to leave. I found Mrs. Calloway in the dining room, arranging a centerpiece. "Hey, I think I'm done for the day," I said, trying to sound casual. "It's getting late, and I've got an early class tomorrow." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Oh, but there's still so much to do. We're paying you for a full day, remember?" "I know, but I can come back tomorrow if you need more help," I said, backing toward the door. Before she could respond, Mr. Calloway appeared behind me. "Everything okay?" he asked, his deep voice making the hair on my neck stand up. "Yeah," I said quickly. "I just need to head out." He exchanged a look with Mrs. Calloway, then smiled. "Of course, let me get your coat." I waited by the door, my pulse pounding. When Mr. Calloway came back, he wasn't holding my coat. Instead, he was holding a heavy, old-fashioned padlock. "What's that for?" I asked, my voice shaking. "For the basement," he said, his smile widening. "We don't want you wandering down there." I bolted for the door, but Mrs. Calloway was faster. She slammed it shut, blocking my way. Now, she said, her voice still calm. "There's no need to leave so soon. We've got one last task for you." "Let me go," I shouted, but Mr. Calloway grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. He dragged me down the hallway toward a door I hadn't noticed before. It was small and unassuming, but when he opened it, a rush of cold air hit me. The basement. I fought against him, but he was too strong. He shoved me down the stairs, and I stumbled, hitting the concrete floor hard. The door slammed shut above me, the sound of the padlock clicking into place echoing in the darkness. The basement was pitch black, the air damp and cold. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated a small, cluttered room filled with storage boxes and old furniture. But as I moved the light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A cage. It was shoved against the far wall, big enough to hold a person. Inside, a woman sat huddled, her face pale and hollow. She looked up when she saw the light, her eyes wide with fear. "Help me," she whispered. "Please." I rushed over and tried to pull the cage door open, but it was locked. "Who are you? What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They tricked me," she said, "just like they tricked you." I didn't have time to ask more questions. Footsteps thudded on the stairs, and I turned to see Mr. Calloway coming down, holding a length of rope. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a rusted pipe from the floor, and swung it as hard as I could. It hit him in the side of the head, and he dropped with a groan. I didn't wait to see if he'd get back up. I ran up the stairs, my heart pounding, and threw myself against the door. It didn't budge. "Adam," Mrs. Calloway called from the other side, her voice icy. "Be a good boy and come back down." I ignored her and slammed my shoulder into the door again and again until the wood splintered. Finally, it burst open, and I ran out of the house without looking back. I called the police as soon as I was safe, and they raided the house later that night. They found the woman in the basement, along with evidence that the Calloways had been luring people in for years. I don't know what they planned to do to me, and I don't want to know. I never answered a Craigslist ad again.